You're listening to episode 231 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Jay Roche joins us to speak about Common Ground Bray, a group dedicated to promoting a cooperative and ecological lifestyle in Bray, Ireland. Hi everyone. Before we get started with today's episode, I want to remind the listeners that we've started a new podcast which may also interest you. It's called Present Moment, Mindfulness, Practice, and Science, and appears every other week, alternating with The Secular Buddhists. You'll find many of the same guests you've enjoyed and learned from here, as well as new researchers, teachers, and practitioners. You'll find Present Moment in the Science and Medicine section of iTunes in Natural Sciences, or just do an iTunes store search for mindfulness and look in the results in the podcast section. You can also visit the website, presentmomentmindfulness.com. Thanks for checking it out, and if you like what you hear, please feel free to share it with others. Do you ever feel like an outsider, even in your own hometown? Maybe not so much of an outsider. Certainly you're known and liked, but you may have a vision for what a community might be that's a little different. That requires dedication to making that vision come alive and building community within your community. Jay Roche is an artist who's guided by an interest in systems that allow the generation of unforeseen results. His work builds around personal imagery and themes, removing the subjective decisions from this process by inviting other artists to interpret his choices. Painting forms a common link in Jay's art, although often the presentation of the work will involve three-dimensional elements, commissioned objects, and maquettes. So sit back, relax, and have a nice Barry's Irish breakfast tea. Our guest today is Jay Roche. Jay, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ted. Delighted to be here.
Very glad to have you here. We've had a couple of Irish-themed episodes lately, and this is a terrific follow-up to the one we recently had with Ian Lawton. And before we go into our main topic for today, Jay, I'd like you to tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what first brought you to Buddhism.
Oh, thanks, Ted. No, it's great to be able to sort of give you something of my history. I think maybe this isn't the way I'd normally introduce myself to most people, but in the context of this podcast, I'd probably go back to a very specific point in my life, maybe to when I was about 7 years old. And I remember sitting in a tree in the back of my garden. You know, I was a great tree climber in those days, sitting there listening to the birds and just generally looking around. It was a lovely summer's day. And suddenly having this feeling of why was there something rather than nothing? That might sound very profound for a 7-year-old, but it just struck me. And from that moment on, you know, which was a very formative moment for me, where I find myself now in some ways, and my relationship with the Dhamma it goes back to that point in time. And I feel really my whole history has either been a running away from that feeling or a moving towards it. And, that question of why is there something rather than nothing? And I'm certainly not saying that I've found the answer to that, but I think my engagement with that question, and particularly through the Dhamma, is developing as time goes on. So I suppose I'm putting that forward as a sort of a genesis point for myself in a way. But maybe to go back to more sort of prosaic kind of biography, I was born in a small town on the east coast of Ireland called Dún Laoghaire, which is just south of Dublin City, which some of the listeners might be more familiar with. So I was brought up a Catholic, as I think 95% of the people in the Republic of Ireland are. So that was the predominant culture that I grew up in. I mean, I would have had quite liberal parents, liberal in the Catholic sense, but the culture that I grew up in was still very conservative. And it was interesting listening to Ian Lawton's interview with you there previously, where he described his own background, growing up educated by the Christian Brothers and so on. Very similar to my own. Quite a harsh sort of education in some ways, and not one that would have enamored me to religion. If anything, it sort of turned me against religion. And, I wouldn't have been the only one of my generation at that time to have reacted in that way. In some ways, by the age of 11, I think I had become a sort of a new atheist 30 years before Hitchens or Harris got there. And I certainly would have given them a run for their money in terms of my anti-clericalism and the vehemence of my atheism at that point. I saw no real sort of reason to believe. And in a lot of ways, it defined my teenage years and was very much a reaction to that sort of Catholic upbringing. I should say, not to jump ahead too much, but I mean, I've softened my atheism a little bit now, even though I would still consider myself to be one. I would consider myself more of a sort of a probabilistic atheist now than having sort of a definite idea that that's the way things are. But at the age of 11, I had sort of turned my back on religion, so to speak, but still carried something of that sense of wonder about the world. I think that I had, as I described, sitting in that tree. So, that curiosity was always there, and I certainly carried that with me.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you raised, Shay, is that even those of us who may be more on the vehement side of atheism, or those of us who are just softer, kinder, gentler in our disbelief, there's still that sense of wonder. There's still part of being a human that does not necessitate the supernatural or a religious set of ideals to support it.
Exactly, Ted. I mean, I don't think I could have articulated it, that way as a teen. Having turned away from any sort of sense of an organized religion providing answers to those questions, I wouldn't have been able to express it in that way. And certainly, I would have gone on, maybe not concerned with religion as such, moving into my early 20s. Well, I should say what I did then, I went on to study art. And that really is my background. I'm trained as a painter, in one way or the other have made my living as an artist since graduating from college. So, a lot of that curiosity went in that direction. And in a way, religion didn't really sort of play a part in my life because it was sort of satisfied in some ways by my artistic practice. And very much by my interest in the creative process, how we discover things, how something blossoms in one's own mind through the process of creativity. And it could give birth to something like a painting or a film or whatever, a piece of writing. And again, maybe jumping forward a little bit, I think it's something in a way that attracted me to the Dhamma, to Buddhism, was a sense that was inherent in that as well. And maybe I'll come back to it a little bit later in our talk. But just to sort of say that that's what I went on to do and have been working as an artist since, both commercially and, on a personal level as well. But moving on, I mean, what I did, I mean, maybe to sort of bring my encounter with Buddhism then, into the picture. In my mid-20s, I went traveled with my wife, my now wife, and we ended up in the south of India, having travelled around for about 3 or 4 months. I met a couple of Buddhist monks on a train coming out of Mangalore. 2 very, very pleasant Tibetan monks in full garb, and we got on great with them. And they invited us up to Sera Monastery, which is quite a well-known monastery in the south of India, which was set up by the Dalai Lama, I think, after the excursion from Tibet. So we ended up staying there for about 2 weeks, and I got to live there. I got to explore the place and get to know a lot of the monks there, and the daily life and so on, and was made feel very welcome. And I have to say, it was my first real sense of what Buddhism was. I always had some idea of it, but I think even up to that stage, I would have mixed it up with the Hare Krishnas or, a lot of Hindu Vedanta, whatever. I had no real sense of what Buddhism actually was, but in those 2 weeks got something of an idea. Now, before I say maybe what you're expecting me to say is that I loved it and I wanted to become a Buddhist. That's not what happened. I didn't like it at all. I found the monastery and the temples and the monastic life too much of a reminder of the Catholicism of my youth. And although it was interesting on a sort of a cultural level, I sort of left the monastery with my wife saying to her, I really don't think that's for me now, or for us, maybe we should get as far away from this as possible. But I have to say my curiosity was piqued, and coincidentally, I got a letter about a week later from a friend who had sent it on to India, and they had written me a letter from Ireland saying that they had become a Buddhist, which was a strange sort of coincidence. I was sort of quite taken by this. It was like I'd just been in a Buddhist monastery, and here was a friend of mine from Ireland saying that they had joined this group in Dublin and were now considering themselves a Buddhist for meditating. They explained something of what that meant, not in a way that I understood much of, but because I respected this person, I thought this is very curious, very strange. If they're into it, there must be something in it. Anyway, I ended up coming home after a couple of months, obviously met my friend and asked him, well, what do you do if you're a Buddhist? What does it entail? And discovered this small group in Dublin at the time. This is going back to about, I should say it was about 1994 in Ireland. So it was well before the mindfulness boom. I certainly would never have heard of mindfulness. Meditation, I would have had some sense of what it might have been. But anyway, there was a small group from the FWBO, Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, who had set up in Dublin. I believe they're now called the Triratna. But at the time, they did a small Sangha in Dublin. And my friend had joined up. He'd started a meditation class with them and had been with them for maybe 2 or 3 months when I arrived back. So I sort of arrived in the FWBO Sangha and started a meditation class. And, I think it was a 6-week class where we were taught the basics of sati and metta. And the way it was presented, the method and the way that they did it, and the sense that they were presenting themselves as a Western sort of form of Buddhism just worked for me. The way they taught meditation made perfect sense. The way they showed how sati had begun with the Buddha and the simplicity of it, the beauty of it was so brilliantly put forward by them that I was totally hooked, with the metta practice as well. I think what sort of worked in a way again, and I've already said it, but it was just the sense that it was something that could work in a Western context, that you didn't have to wear these robes or funny hats or whatever, that you could lead you could live a life in Dublin and you could be a meditator and you could maybe even be part of a Sangha if you wanted, was something that just really opened up a whole new world for me. And I have to give them credit for that. And I know they still have a presence in Dublin. They're still here. So that was great. That was really the first beginnings for me of the Dhamma in my life. Although I would have called it the Dharma at that time. There was more of an emphasis maybe on the Mahayana side of the teachings from them. So any kind of idea of the early Pali teachings that wouldn't have been my first introduction then. It was more maybe about the Heart Sutra, the Lotus Sutra and things like that. So it was great. Again, mid-90s. I spent about 2 years very involved and very much a part of the FWBO Sangha, along with my friend and a number of other friends. I met some great people, some of whom I still know. But I think as time went on, I found just that particular group and the way that Buddhism was presented just maybe a little bit too insular for me. Often I was involved in a lot of social politics at the time. I was getting married. I was beginning to have a family. And in a way, the type of Sangha that was being presented to me at that time was a little bit too far from that, you know. It emphasized a certain amount of segregation of the sexes, maybe not so much an emphasis on family life, but on sort of more group activity and things like that, which is fine. And I've nothing against that, but it wasn't the direction that I wanted to go in myself. So I sort of gradually sort of eased out of that and continued a meditation practice, but sort of lost a sense of connection with a sort of a group of Buddhists or a Sangha.
How did things evolve for you, Jay, as you encountered the Pali Canon and got a little bit more comfortable with that? How did that occur?
That's a really good question, Ted, because I think the other thing I came away with from that period was a misunderstanding of some of the core teachings. And, you know, this is certainly, you know, bringing it up to the present, but the Pali Canon, you know, and my study of that has really sort of cleared up for me, but also a lot of the ways that certain teachers have been able to, you know, clarify aspects of the early teachings that I don't think was put across very well in my first encounters with Buddhism going back to the 90s. So take, for example, you know, the Four Noble Truths. I think in some ways I lost some sense of what the core idea of Buddhism was out of a misunderstanding of them, you know, and it wasn't until, let's say, somebody like Stephen Batchelor, you know, framing them as tasks, you know, and going back to the early framework that the Buddha put on them, that I really sort of got it, you know, and this really is jumping ahead maybe 10 or 15 years, you know. So there was sort of a little bit of a wilderness period going on. You know, if you're a Christian, you might say you lost your faith. In some ways, I sort of lost confidence in Buddhism in that sense, in the sort of theoretical sense, or the sense of what, you know, what nirvana might be or what enlightenment might be in a very practical sense, you know, and it sort of, in a way, resulted in really a sort of a period of time where my meditation practice lapsed, and, you know, I certainly would not have identified as a Buddhist maybe for a good decade after that period of time. So, you know, it wasn't up until about, you know, say about 2010 that a very good friend of mine, you know, and this always for me seems to happen, you know, as the people say, you know, with a little help from our friends, you know, friends always seem to pop in at the right moment. And
our friends on the path, Kalyanamitas.
Kalyanamitas, that's exactly it, Ted. I well put. This is so important, and I'll mention that again maybe later, the idea of spiritual friendship. This good spiritual friend offered me two brilliant books. One of them was Hardcore Zen by Brad Warner, and the other was Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist by Stephen Batchelor. And both of them sort of blew my mind. In a way, they presented the Dhamma to me in a fresh light. Both books in different ways. I think Brad's book, in a way of just saying, look, you know, you can be a Buddhist in many different ways. You know, in the modern world. And I know you've interviewed Brad, and he puts that across really in a brilliant way. And so his book sort of loosened it all up for me. And then Stephen's book, in a more intellectual way, just sort of presented the Dhamma in a totally fresh light. And, you know, it meshed with my inherent skepticism, I suppose my more sort of secular sort of approach to the world and so on. It gave me a way of being a Buddhist again. And I mean, I'm indebted to Stephen in that sense, you know, that he could do that. And I mean, I don't think even Confessions of a Buddhist Atheist is the best book in which he does that. It was only after that I went and read every other one of his books. And, you know, maybe, you know, Buddhism Without Beliefs is maybe a better book in a way to really frame that, you know. So, but just being presented with that book at that time was just perfect. And it started me meditating again and really asking myself, how can I be a Buddhist now in the world? And in a way, that's what the last 5 years of my life has kind of been about, you know.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that story and that background. And it's interesting that it's not a straight line for us, that we have these gaps and it takes some twists and turns. And yet there's something in the practice, in how this manifests in our lives that resonates with us, that it connects with this intellectual, emotional, all the different aspects of being human are part of what we enliven with the practice, with the Dhamma.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, it is so enriching. And, I think when I look back at, say, the period prior to reconnecting with a practice again, I can see so much of what was missing. But, sometimes you just do weave in and out. And I think maybe we're not ready either, at certain points in time to really engage with the practice in a way that sort of clicks, It's like that question I started off our talk with, this sense of why that we ask ourselves sometimes, that question can seem so different at different times in our life. And when I sort of re-encountered the Dhamma, it just seemed to answer part of that question in a much more profound way than it had maybe before. And, really the last 5 years have been just an exploration of that, not always, sort of finding all the answers, but certainly, encountering so much out of asking that question.
So let's shift a little bit in our topic. I want to ask what it's been like for you doing this practice in what is predominantly a Christian culture. What's that been like?
No, that's a great question, and one that I sort of take pleasure in answering. I think Ian Lawton in his interview, you sort of touched on this about Ireland. Ireland's a very interesting country in the sense that we're probably far more Christian than a lot of other Western sort of democracies, and certainly the Catholic culture that it still plays a very, very important role in the way that people think about things. Even for people that might not immediately identify as, Catholic or might be a sort of a weekly mass goer, there is very much a sense that their moral life, even their intellectual life, is very much framed by Catholic teachings, by the church. And I think, if you travel to another country not far from here, let's say Holland or Germany, people just are not influenced by religion in the same way as they still are in Ireland. So to grow up in that, and then, as just to follow up on your question, to be practicing a different religion is, has a sort of a different flavor because of that, So on one level, you have to be more emphatic, I think, in saying that, you are not a Christian. So that's one thing that does tend to come up, because people will certainly make the assumption more than they might maybe in a different culture. And then you have to go the other step of saying, well, actually, I'm a Buddhist, it's so there's sort of two steps to it. So that's often interesting. I mean, I think the other thing as well is that on a more positive side, I should say that maybe the fact that we're a more religious country does allow people to maybe take you more seriously when you say that you have a religion of some kind, There isn't a sort of an indifference to it, So I've had that experience as well, where in fact my interest in Buddhism and my identification as a Buddhist is probably taken on a little bit more than it might be elsewhere. I've had a couple of experiences like that. So there's, it's a sort of a double-edged sword in a way.
Interesting. Well, tell us about Common Ground Bray. What is that? How did it get started?
Yeah, so Common Ground, really what it is, it's sort of a grassroots movement that has sort of, evolved out of living in this small town on the east coast of Ireland. It's something that's sort of come together out of a group of people really just trying to look for sort of an alternative to the sort of consumer fueled approach that we've sort of particularly had in this country over the last 10 or 15 years. We had a very bad recession in Ireland that brought a lot of people down below the poverty line and made just sort of basic living very difficult. So there was a real sort of drive, I think, amongst a lot of people to try and find an alternative way of kind of living their lives, or maybe, certainly sort of trying to sort of in a less sort of consumerist way. So, what we did really in the town was just try to get together this group and form a little cooperative, find a little premises. We have a building in the center of the town where I think it was one of the best things that we did early on, because it had meant that we could meet. and we could sort of form a community around a space rather than something that was too virtual, just sort of up on Facebook or based around a website or so on. So, I mean, I should emphasize, Ted, as well that, it wasn't specifically a Buddhist community. I would have certainly been bringing some of those ideas to it. But what it was trying to do was to get people who were certainly mindful in their approach to life. And there are many people involved in this community who, would have come from maybe, sort of studying mindfulness or other types of sort of, personal kind of development backgrounds. So it was from the beginning very much, we wanted to try and promote a kind of an integrated and very mindful kind of lifestyle. But also, create something that was fun for people, where they could get together. So we've encouraged, meetup nights for people. We've a small little shop that we run. We try and encourage people to bring stuff that they've made themselves to sell there. Certainly the whole idea of promoting certain practices like yoga and Tai Chi, or other practices like that, at a very cheap and affordable kind of rate, so that somebody that might be living on social welfare can come along and do that, and they can source healthy food as well, because we sell wholesale, and it allows a lot of the people who are involved in this community to get food, and it's like good food, not junk food, at a really, really sort of, cheap and affordable price. But I think first and foremost, what it has done, and we've a very solid membership now in the town, is create that sense of community where people can come along and they can share sort of experiences and ideas as well. We've a lot of open evenings where someone will come along and give a talk. It could be Dhamma related, or it could be just something maybe to do with a little bit of social politics within the town, or so on and so forth. So it's become very much a hub of information for people as well, sort of in a way, sort of off the grid information as well. It's been also about empowering a certain part of the community here as well. People who might not have a voice, but can find a place to sort of have a voice as well.
And you're also concerned with environmental issues as well. Say a little bit about that.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that is first and foremost is promoting a kind of an ecological lifestyle, certainly one that is sensitive to the environment and really how we're treating the environment. And I think this is such a huge issue that it's just something that we cannot turn our attention from it. And, through Common Ground, to try and live their lives in a way that, maybe their carbon footprint is a little bit less, that they maybe are more mindful about where they buy, what they spend their money on. So it's really is promoting that. But also the other thing is that what Common Ground has become is a hub for other groups within Ireland, and certainly within this locality, who would have a very, very much who are very involved in the environment, to come and talk and give talks and to promote their activities, throughout the community here. So that's been really great, and it's been really, really good to sort of feel that we're a sort of a conduit for that.
Now, as part of this overall portfolio that's part of Common Ground Bray, and for folks who are listening, there's a link on the episode page to commongroundbray.com, so be sure to check that out. But there's also a WordPress, a blog that you do, braymeditationspace.wordpress.com. And again, I'll be linking that on the episode page. Wondering if you could say, Jay, a little bit about that and how that's been received and how that blog is going.
That's great, Ted. Thanks for asking. Again, I would emphasize that we don't present Common Ground as specifically Buddhist in any way, but what we did want to do was create a space in Common Ground, which was very much to do with contemplation or reflection, maybe even the idea of non-action. Because I think when you get something that might be quite, in some ways sort of socially political, like Common Ground, people see it as action. They see it as something where you have to go out and act. You have to do this. You have to do that. Sometimes it's important, not to act, to be quiet, to maybe retreat a little bit and to think or contemplate about what you're doing. So what I wanted to do, and maybe this is what I felt I could bring to the group, was to provide that space. So we're very lucky within Common Ground to have a rather beautiful room, which is part of the building that we're using, which is perfect for as a little Zendo or meditation room. So what I did about a year ago is I sort of invited and I opened the room as a place for meditation practice, not just to the Common Ground group, but just to the Bray town as a whole. Really just to allow people to sort of give them that space and make it available. You know, in a lot of ways, I didn't have an agenda either to sort of promote this as specifically Buddhist either. And I mean, this again goes back to I think to something that Stephen Batchelor has talked about in terms of the you know, what is a secular sangha? What might Buddhism become? Where the Dhamma might go? You know, in some ways, I think by restricting it to Buddhism might not be that way. I don't know. It's still a little bit of an experiment. And I think particularly maybe people who are interested in your podcast and the blog, you know, would be coming from a lot of different angles on that. So I think all these thoughts were going through my head when I opened the space up. So it gradually just sort of built. And obviously people who were involved in Common Ground came a lot of other people as well. And it's become very, very popular. I mean, I'd say we have a good group of maybe 40 or 50 people who are sort of, you know, I mean, they wouldn't all arrive on the day that we meditate, but, you know, certainly 10, 15 people would turn up and we would sit for half an hour. And we have also started to do a few small readings, you know, maybe from the suttas or, you know, whatever people want to bring along if they feel it's relevant to a sort of a contemplative approach to life. So, you know, really, you know, that space has been going great. And out of that, really in the last few months, I thought it would be quite nice to sort of reflect some of the discussion that's going on within the group as in the form of a blog. I'm a great fan of a few Dhamma blogs, and one in particular that I really do love is Justin Merritt's Simple Suttas. You know, I like the conciseness of them, and you know the way that you can drop into them. You know, they're not too long. You get a little idea discussed, and you can come away with something quite rich out of that. So, in a way, that was sort of my model for the blog, and I'm only doing it a couple of months now, but it's been a great way of sort of filtering some of the ideas that are coming through the experience of holding the meditation space and talking to some of the people that have come along. So. I'm quite excited about it. I enjoy writing. I'm trying to keep it to about 500 words per blog, so it doesn't get too wordy. And just sort of see where it goes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thanks for doing that. Appreciate it. I know Justin will be delighted to know that he had some influence on that. Jay, I'm wondering what else is there that you'd like to share with the listeners from your experience in Common Ground Bray, in your own practice? What else would you like to say and give voice to?
Yeah, I mean, I would certainly say, first of all, thank you, Ted, for letting me put some of this across. And I have to say your dedication to this and, you know, looking after this, the website and the podcast is just so appreciated from my end. I mean, I think hearing other people's stories through the podcast and having, you know, the resource of the website there has been a real inspiration. And it, you know, at certain times when you feel that you maybe feel a little bit alone in this sort of, you know, practice, it's something that's brilliant to go back to and be enriched by. So I really have to thank you for that. It's been really great.
Pleasure's all mine, and it's so much a team effort of the people who've been spending time working on the site. Dana, Mark, Jennifer, other people who've been posting on a regular basis, Doug, just terrific efforts by so many people to bring this and share it with others.
It's a great resource and well worth it. So thanks again.
Anything else?
I mean, I was going to say, you know, two very important sort of influences on my involvement, let's say, in Common Ground. One being the Nagara Sutta, as I mentioned, but I think the other one that I didn't mention was Gary Snyder's essay on Buddhist anarchism. I don't know whether you're familiar with it, Ted, but some people may be. And I think it was something that was written back in the 60s. And before, you know, people get too alarmed with the idea of anarchism because it can very negative connotation. But he wrote a very interesting essay. Certainly, the anarchism he's talking about really is the one. It's more to do with a sort of a collectivization, or how powerful in a way that a community that is organized and is working along the lines of equality, how powerful that can be. And it has great resonance with the idea of Sangha, I think. And what Gary Snyder does, I think, is he correlates the two very well in that essay. And I found that very inspiring at the time, because I think there is a danger in politicizing the Dhamma. I don't actually believe one should, because I think it should be beyond politics. But there are certain mechanisms that I think work better. And there is something that seems to chime quite nicely in the basic sort of ideas behind anarchism and some of the early sort of ideas what the Buddha put forward for a Sangha, which was very non-hierarchical and very egalitarian. So, that was certainly an inspiration. I sometimes go back to Gary's essay and read it, and I'd highly recommend it for a lot of people. It's a really great one. So that was all really. I just sort of miss saying that.
Great. Well, thank you, Jay, for sharing that. Our guest today, Jay Roche. You can find out more about what Jay is doing at commongroundbray.com. And I'll be linking to that as well as their Facebook and the blog that's on there. Jay, thank you so much for being here. I've really enjoyed speaking with you.
Thanks, Ted. Really enjoyed it as well.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.